Matt, you set this up. I think we're here to talk about how do we represent vendor concerns in the project, and sort of an idea that I think Jacques had floated in the past that people seem to think might have some promise is maybe having like a vendor working group or artifice, location, whatever in the community for any vendor to represent their concerns and what they wanted to get out of the project versus having that be something that we have to land people on steering for. So is that the right discussion topic? Matt, Jacques, anyone?
Yeah, so I was mostly going off of it being just something that we had discussed, right? Like we were going from a largely vendor seat model to a model where seats are, well, I mean, I say going to, right? The proposal that's currently being discussed. And so I think the question that's been raised a few times is how are vendors represented in that world other than sort of twisting their employees' arms who happen to sit on one of these bodies. Yeah, so, I mean, we can also discuss other things. That was just one of the things that I think we had flagged in the previous discussion for, you know, further discussion.
Gotcha. So maybe we can just talk about that one first, since that's some continuity with the previous discussion. Here's something that I've had difficulty kind of squaring the circle around is, you know, thinking about the fact that, like, getting if you think about you want to gain influence in a project to represent your vendor concerns and you feel like you've got to get somebody onto steering, it's like, you know, there's not a lot of seats in steering. And Jaice, I see you joined. Welcome. Because I was about to mention something that you had mentioned last time, which is maybe it would be productive to think about the types of concerns that vendors have that they want represented, and sort of decompose those and think about, you know, which of those are things that would require like steering or TOC type of input or decision making versus ones that don't. And Jaice, I'm sure you could put a better wording around that, but I want to say that you brought up in our discussion on last Wednesday, kind of decomposing that sprawling topic into specific things that vendors might be concerned about and want representation on.
Yeah, and sorry I'm late. So I think that the one thing that's really harmful and dangerous to any open source community, whether it's in a foundation or not, is that if there's motivations or direction or efforts underway that don't have transparency or around what the actual motivation is. And I think that there have been cases where vendors have a clear fiscal interest in promoting something to unlock a sale. So, which is totally reasonable and rational, right? I mean, at the end of the day, we're in this as a financial endeavor in a lot of ways. So I think that what the idea around thinking through vendor specific problems is that our best case scenario is that a vendor can come in to the project, want to contribute resources, and help drive some specific piece of functionality that may unlock sales or funding from VC or whatever that is. And it's done in a completely transparent, open way. And so what that means is that it's either going to be in alignment with, neutral to, or counter to the direction of the project as stands. Because in most cases, vendors can monetize just fine with the existing feature set of a project. It's when that sort of friction case comes up of, I need this specific thing to unlock that. Kubernetes had a lot of these things like the cloud provider wars that happened early in the life of Kubernetes, where every cloud provider wanted to have in-tree support, so it looked like it was a first-class quote-unquote cloud for Kubernetes. Like, we've seen this before, and that the decisions can be localized and cordoned off from the main project in ways, or whatever that is, whatever those decision-making processes are, as long as they're transparent and open, I think that's the key, right? And so as a vendor, if you come in and you know that something is counter to the direction of the project, you need to have some recourse to actually untangle what that looks like. Like, how are you being blocked? Why are you being blocked? Is it really truly that you're making a short-term decision on behalf of the project that is deleterious for the long-term of the project? Or is this a legit use case that maybe just hasn't been exposed to the project because everybody's a cloud provider and you're an end user, or whatever those things look like? There has to be some governance mechanism to go through that analysis from a technical and a project stewardship standpoint, and have that voice heard. Now, if there's a case where there's completely opaque motivation coming from some vendor in the project, and people just start cranking out code for something that doesn't seem to have any support in the project, that's another problem entirely. You definitely want to avoid that. So my idea is that what are the things that we can insert into governance specifically that can handle those two cases? The insertion of effort for an outcome that is unknown, the insertion of effort that is known but may or may not agree with the roadmap of the product or the project itself. Does that seem like a fair clarification of the problems?
I'm trying to make sure that I captured everything you said. There's a lot of good content there, and unfortunately I was setting up the notes doc during part of it. So I'll maybe just ask folks if they can check my note-taking there. But the last things I got, Jaice, were around insertion of effort for outcome that is unknown, or insertion of effort for outcome that is known where it may not be fully aligned with existing direction.
Yeah, for sure.
Part of the motivation for suggesting a specific named forum for vendor concerns was also to create a clear separation between what the steering committee does in terms of individuals with an individual sort of remit or democratic legitimacy, to avoid even the appearance that vendor interests were being represented by proxy through the steering committee by giving it an explicit forum. People might still suspect that, right? But we'd have a stronger case that there's a true independence with that forum. And of course, it might turn out that nothing of value comes from a vendor working group, like it doesn't add anything substantial or meaningful. And we might say, you know, we've tried this for a year. We don't think it really added anything, so we're just going to tie it up. Or we might keep it. Who knows?
Jacques, I wanted to make sure that I captured what you just said in the notes well enough. Julz, I think I saw you put a comment into chat.
Busted. I guess so, yes.
Sorry, Doug and Julz.
I was mostly responding to what Doug said.
Yes,
okay, Doug,
yes.
Want to go?
Yeah, sure. So I don't know whether you intended it to be this way, Paul, but I interpreted your comment as if you need to get onto the steering committee in order to get what you need out of the project, then chances are we have bigger problems with the project. And I agree with that sentiment if that's what you're trying to basically say. That's why, you know, in the past I've said I'm not sure we actually need an SC, but that's a different topic. Because I'd like to have them as little power as possible. I'd like to see if we get to the mode where most decisions are strictly technical decisions as low down in the hierarchy as possible.
Right.
Yeah, and I think, oh, sorry, go ahead, Julz.
No, go for it.
I was just going to say, Doug, I think the way that you characterize it is close. Here's another here's another thing that's related to that I'm maybe not sure if I verbalized well enough, which is, say that I'm a vendor deciding whether or not to make a new investment in a project. Say it's Knative. If I've got to get someone onto steering to be represented, it sort of puts a wall between me and making that investment, right? Like, I think that we should have I think we'd be well served to grow the number of participating vendor presences if any vendor can represent their needs.
I know.
Go ahead, Julz. Oh, sorry.
I see Matt's. Well, all I was going to say is I think the only area that I'm disagreeing there a little is that's how it should be set up, right? But the steering committee is the thing that has to set it up that way, and if that is failing, it's the steering committee that's going to be responsible for unfailing it, if you see what I mean. And it is a failure if the steering committee has to get involved to make sure the project is going in the direction of things. But I do worry, like there's just that little worry in the back of my head of like, what about when it's not an ideal world?
I think Marcus had his.
Yeah.
Matt had his hand up first. So Matt, you go first.
Courtesy wars.
I'll put my sort of short spin on it, right? Like, I think our aspirations for the project are that there are more vendors involved than we will probably ever have seats on steering, right? And some of those will be really small. It'll be hard for them to make the sorts of commitments to the project that are needed to really get someone into some of those seats, right? And so I think that we need to find a way to enable vendors to have representation in the community without necessarily, needing to sort of. That's my train of thought. I think I got my point across.
I think I agree with what most of you are saying. I think as a community, it should always be bottom up, right? So decisions should be from the least, from as low down in the quote unquote hierarchy. I don't want to even use the word hierarchy, but as low down as you can. And we should only resort to all of these functions that we have. And that even starts with the working group leads, right? So even in the autoscaling working group, the individual contributors should be able to decide and to influence what happens like to the project and to the autoscaling working group in general. I view my personal position as a autoscaling lead and similar as my position on the TOC, and I expect or hope that the steering committee views it similarly as purely a, well, it's called steering, right? So you put up some boundaries maybe, but most of the time you should be, I'd like to be the person that people resort to if they cannot resolve their issues between each other. If a discussion goes in circles and stuff like that, that's where people come in and help sort that out. But I completely agree that everything else should be, like we should not resort to these mechanisms as much as we can. So
Marcus, can I try to paraphrase maybe what you said? I think the part that you said out loud is that individual contributors should be able to influence the project direction. As a leader in our community, you want to feel empowered to resolve issues if you need to do so, but want to enable those individual contributors to influence the project direction.
Right, absolutely. It's voted, like I'm elected by these people, right? So
Yeah.
in that sense, in an ideal, like in a democracy, ideally I represent like the majority of people in that sense. And so that should solve itself ideally. Like people should vote on ideas and stuff like that. And I don't even need to come in and decide something because they have a majority vote on something and that's it.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that I heard in what you said, Marcus, is maybe maybe an idea about what representation might mean with regard to vendors in terms of, and I think this might be a good chance to like make sure that we're all thinking in the same way. So to me, just speaking as myself, when I think vendor representation, I don't think that necessarily means that there's some part of the community where like where vendors get to influence decisions directly. I guess I think about the use case of I think about the use case as of kind of like I'm making a decision about whether I want to make a new investment, right, as one use case, and I've got my vendor hat on and I'm saying these are my priorities across all the functional groups or functional areas that that I'm concerned about, that I want to try to get out of the project. When I think vendor representation, I think of that as like there's a flavor of it that might be like a help desk. It's like, okay, well, these are the areas that you should engage in and discuss with people and like attend the working group, share your use case, create an issue, that kind of stuff. Doesn't necessarily mean that like that it's a source of power within the community, if that makes sense. And I just want to see, Marcus, if maybe there's an assumption about what representation means to you that's coming through in what you said. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah. And I think you captured what my thinking about, like my ideal thinking about that investment that you talked about is you send people into the community and people like work with the community and they get known in the community, they build trust with the community. And that is what gives you, it's hard to put it into like the usual business terms in terms of, I don't want to say it gives you leverage, but it gives you, it puts people in the community and other people in the existing community start to trust these people because they help and things like that. And that's where you can like start shaping the way the project is going more and more through just being part of the community, not by necessarily starting to obtain a leadership position in that community from the get-go.
Yeah. I wonder if anybody else like might have some thoughts connected with like, what does representation mean to you?
I had a slightly different topic, so if someone wants to talk about representation first, I will wait.
Oh, we have one other hand up.
I'll talk slightly about representation. Just the one because I agree with what Marcus is saying. Like the decision should be made as low as possible, and it's always the failure cases that I'm a little that I worry about. Right? It's okay. We've got this representation at the bottom. What about when there is a broader decision that we need to escalate? So, and especially when we've got like, what is this project about decisions? For example, just like off the top of my head, right? Do we care about the use case of multi-tenancy, right? Like, you know, as a Knative as a service workloads. There are trade-offs that you would make one way or the other. Multi-container is a disaster if you want to do multi-tenant Knative, but it's a great feature if you want to do it. So there are trade-offs, right? And I feel like we kind of have, there's almost like a confusion, or we are like, so in the Cloud Foundry ecosystem, there's product managers and there's engineering, right? And they are not the same function. And that it feels like we're asking the engineers and the working group leads to be product managers, and I'm not sure they have the input required to do a good job of that. Right? To be a good product manager, I just came from Cloud Foundry where I was doing this. You need to be talking to people, right? You need to have the information about what people want from your product. And I don't know how in a working group we get that information. So I guess what I'm saying is the representation is all in that world, all the decisions, all the representation is happening from the engineering people. And I'm an engineer, so yay, but I'm not sure that's actually right.
Well, Julz, here's what I heard, which is when you hear working group, you think engineers, and you're not sure if like someone in an engineering role is like necessarily the best person to represent these types of concerns on behalf of their employer, maybe?
Not just on behalf of the employer, right? Like on behalf of our users. Like it's better in Knative than other projects because it is an engineering project. So our users are engineers, so we can have some level of empathy for them. But we're not our users, right? We are all very familiar with Kubernetes and things like that. And I don't know that we do have a great deal of empathy for people deploying Knative in production or people using Knative in production and what those people want from Knative. Right, to do a good job of that is a job, right? Is a job that people take years to get good at, right? That job is PMing, that job is product management, and it is a profession to itself with a way of doing things. And it feels like there's a gap where product management should be in how some of these decisions would be made.
So just real quick, we've got a couple hands up. I'm glad that you said that because I want to just surface that I think when we say working group, there's no reason that a PM can't join that group. And there's no reason that a like executive personality can't join that group. So I think that it's good to surface, you know, that maybe engineers aren't always the best suited, but that doesn't mean that we can't have an open process.
I think I'm right in saying we currently have 0 PMs in any of the working groups, so it's not currently working.
We got a couple hands up. Chris, I think your hand was up first, and then Ville.
Yeah. I'm just wanted to tell that I'm pretty much wanted to tell the same thing that Julz said, but maybe I will only add that if we not give a clear way for vendors to speak for themselves, we will be in position that vendors will force their opinion by their employees, and is really not ideal to set up a project like this. And for example, the steering for me is for those decisions that working groups cannot take. For example, the decision like Julz said that has trade-offs. You trade something for something. So you cannot choose either. Or for example, those hard decisions like, for example, should we integrate with vendors the technologies X, Y, Z or not? And if we don't integrate with that technology, maybe we will lose that vendor from community and lose their input, valuable input. So that's the decision like for project steering for exactly. And how the working group can answer that? I think the technical aspect of that it isn't really technical. It's just about project, about good health of project, about financing, about funding, about teams, about health of teams, about all of that. And that really depends on if the vendors are feeling healthy in the project and if they're feeling that they can be heard, really. So, yeah.
So I'm sorry, Ville, you had your hand up. Why don't you go?
Go as in get out of the meeting, or go as in talk?
Please talk.
Okay, so yeah, so I just wanted to plus one Marcus's comment, not that it needs it because I think it's gotten enough, but the position should be pushed to the lowest level where they make sense, and only in the exceptional cases should things bubble up. And as long as we have the infra and the procedures in place to go and support that, then perhaps we can, unless there's huge disagreements on that, maybe we can take that as an action item to go and figure out and kind of eval, do we feel that we have the appropriate structures in places or not? As far as to Julz's comment about the PMs, that is something that, yes, thank you. So one of the things that came up in the eventing retro, again, we talked about that in the past as well, is how do we go ahead and actually get enough feedback and PM involvement? We had a long time ago in Seattle, in a bunch where we had a bunch of vendors coming in, and there was a lot of PM representation, and that was extremely valuable. And I would like to go ahead and use this as a call for help on that, because I was just gonna go bother various vendors and go like, hey, come hang out with us. We are actually pretty nice people, some of us. So I agree with that point as well, and I'm not sure if folks have suggestions, but we need help on that.
I think Michael,
Yeah,
Michael has his hand up next.
Thank you. Yeah, just a quick comment before I come to my actual comment on the PM side. We have at least one PM on the call, which is Doug. Doug is an offering manager on our side. So just wanted to make sure we don't miss that one. I agree in terms of the decision making. I agree that, like, on a day-to-day basis, decisions should be made on the lowest level. I think this is no different in an open source project like this compared to how we do daily work in each of our companies. You want to make decisions on a day-to-day basis on the lowest possible level. I think what we have to determine or decide on is, like, if there is conflict in terms of certain decisions, what's the ultimate decision power to resolve the conflict? Like in our companies, we usually have established structures and we know who to go to make such a decision. And I think we need some sort of equivalent, I don't want to call it structure, but definition of roles and responsibilities within an open source project like this.
Yes, a steering committee done well is a group of people who represent very high trust in a project, who are personally invested and probably professionally invested in the success of the project, who are looking at the 1+ year horizon of the life cycle of the project and will insulate disruptive changes that might net short-term gain for either some or part of the project versus others, and are paying attention to the signal that, is the project healthy or not? Is it successful or not? Is it trending positive? Is it trending negative? Like, just a little bit of archaeology history here. Remember that Kubernetes Steering Committee came from a very specific, huge problem, which was the project was dying. I don't think a lot of people realize how bad the project got before the steering committee, where basically issues were rotting and people weren't paying attention to any of the metrics or other things that were necessary to understand the project was healthy. And what happened was, like, basically the elders of the project, Brendan and other folks, I was in the room when this happened, and we were like, we've got to do something. Somebody actually has to pay attention to the overall health of the project, because otherwise it's going to die. We can see these things dying right now. So the idea of the steering committee is that longevity, the overall health of the project. And unfortunately, to ensure that, you do require some enforcement powers, which is basically the enforcement of decisions that may be for longer term gain over short term gains. And so I think that it's, if you're really framing the power of the steering committee in terms of steering the long-term horizon, that's where the power is, right? The power is not, you know, this quarter in this release of Knative, we're going to do this and this and this and eventing. It's like, those are important decisions, but they're more localized. They're more focused on tactical, whereas the strategic decisions that ensure long-term health will be in the steering committee. And so product is right in between those two things, because product and delivery should have healthy tension. Because product people are going to be like, I need this thing for my customers yesterday. And people are like, well, we have to clean up this debt because otherwise you're not going to be able to do anything. And so those healthy tensions can happen at a much smaller granular level than the long-term decisions about, wow, our net issue stale dates are now trending toward weeks. People are sitting for weeks with PRs not being merged. Like that's what the steering committee can do and should do. And that's not any company, that's the project. Like the project will die without that kind of help.
I see a lot of activity in the chat. Anybody want to take a crack at surfacing that one?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I was commenting that I think that there is a substantial, or that I wanted to rebut Doug's comment that do we need steering? I think we do. I think that there's a substantial number of things involved in having a successful project that are non-technical in nature. And I think that would be steering's remit to take care of those aspects of project health. Jaice talked about a few of them. I think, you know, making sure that we have a way that we welcome people into the community, asking like, what's the onboarding experience for contributors, is not something that TOC or working groups are necessarily going to be good at. But it's important if we want people coming onto the project and helping out and contributing. Similarly, you know, end users, what's their experience in terms of, you know, understanding what the project's about and, you know, actually getting support. A thing that I don't know how to assess, and I would appreciate, you know, someone who, you know, some set of people going and taking a look at, and I would put steering on this is, hey, you know, lots of people show up asking questions about their install, which may or may not be a specific vendor version. We've also recently, you know, sort of organically or by TOC put together some rotations for answering those questions. Are we worried about, you know, oh, hey, we've got, you know, 10 people from Google on here. They'll tend to steer people towards Google solutions and not towards like Red Hat solutions. That's a complete hypothetical. I actually haven't looked at the numbers. But, you know, that seems like the kind of thing that probably matters to us as a community. There should be a set of people looking at it. Having the authority to make changes would mean that steering, you know, has a fairly broad remit. I would hope that steering doesn't use that excessively. In the same way that, you know, in the United States, the Supreme Court, you know, has the ability to reinterpret the law, but a lot of the times they constrain themselves to pretty small and narrow questions because it helps everybody if you're not looking over your shoulder wondering, you know, hey, is this, you know, am I going to get reversed, you know, tomorrow because I made a decision that made sense to me, but, you know, somebody else didn't like it. No, that's what I had to say. I think that steering is useful for all of the other aspects of the project that are basically humans and logistics.
Yeah, sorry, I joined late, but from my perspective, steering was supposed to be like the board of directors. Like I always kind of, to, you know, tie on to like the government analogy, it was kind of like, you know, you have, gosh, any sort of analogy with our current government is a mistake. But, you know, like you have the one body that kind of like is overseeing everything, but then you have TOC that's actually the one that is like driving the day-to-day, you know, like what's happening in the project, the work. not to diminish what steering does, but the technical work, you know, when we think of a project, that's what we're thinking of as code, let's be honest. But that the recognition that there is all this administrative stuff that kind of goes on with a project, and the idea was like, let's separate that role from the folks that want to work on the project and the technical decisions. Knock on lots of wood, like we haven't had code of conduct issues, but it's things like that of like, you know, let's take this to a group that can deal with all of that fun stuff. And it's not going to then slow down the velocity of the overall project, because you're not going to bog down your TOC leads and your work, theoretically, and your working group leads, you know, with this kind of other administrative stuff. And then from a logistical perspective, you also have the issue of like, who's going to pay the bill for Slack and assorted testing, like things like that, you know. And so I think there's this model that we could potentially have where like you have the big corporate players have a representation on a steering board because they're usually the ones paying the bill. But then there's also, you know, community feedback, whether that's like seats, like Istio recently changed theirs, whether that's like seats from the community or whatever. But I think there is this need, you know, to balance it. And then it looks like a lot of the stuff in the chat, there is this kind of perception of like the term steering apparently is really loaded with a lot of stuff. And it's something that we've always joked is like, who knew so many people wanted to work on marketing? It's actually, you know, like a lot of what steering works on is stuff like that. So maybe it is something like, you know, we can be better at naming. I know in one of our previous meetings, we actually have a list, and it's on me to update the PR, I apologize, of like the things that steering, you know, really going more granular than what we have currently on the repo of like what steering, what their, you know, charter is. And a lot of it is, you know, it's that administrative type stuff. There is one part in it that I think we could, you know, review, but there's like one part that says that like steering has allocated its, you know, authority over the technical part to the TOC. And I wonder if like, you know, it's worth considering just saying, we're just going to make that the TOC's role. And it's not that steering has decided to delegate that authority. They just don't have it. But that's just kind of some thoughts to think through. But I do think there's a lot of value in a name change, if that would, and it seems like some folks in the comments were saying like, you know, maybe changing the name from steering would be helpful. And then it's like, what do you change it to? And I'm totally on board with like herders of puppies, but I demand there be real puppies. So Jaice, I expect puppy. But yeah, I think, you know, if we can come up with some kind of a name that it's really, that you know, people, that the community understands exactly what the group does. Like CNCF has a governing board and a TOC, but I know there were some folks that didn't like the governing aspect. So maybe it's just an advisory board or whatever.
I put my hand up, and I think I'm the only one with my hand up currently. So April, what I heard is that like, of the dimensions that you named, like the one that seems to touch vendors is like the who's going to pay the bills for cloud resources, Slack, etc. And here's my question. It's not necessarily to you, it's to everybody. Is like, do we need to have the logistics concerns represented in steering? Or can we have a place outside of steering where like there's a, as Matt pointed out earlier, ideally we were having like way more vendors making an investment in the project than available seats on steering. Can we represent that logistical concern and the monetary type concern about like cloud resources, Slack, et cetera, in another part of the community so that we like keep the money aspect clean from the administrative aspect and vice versa? Is my kind of general question to the group.
Since there was a pause, I was going to say, it seems like steering would need to answer questions like, if Google said, hey, we're tired of paying for Slack, we're going back to the free version, steering, it doesn't seem like you'd need someone from Google on steering for Google to make that decision. Steering would be left to figure out, hey, do we want history? Do we want to do the free, go back to the free plan, or do we want to find somebody else to stump that up? But it doesn't seem like Google would need to be in the steering committee to make that decision. It's Google's money. They can just stop paying the bill.
I guess my thought is like I understand what Paul's saying, but then I also think like that's kind of what steering was supposed to be. It was an independent group that kind of just did those kind of, project adjacent things. And in the interest of, I think Doug had said before, of like keeping it as, small as possible, of like, do we really need to add like a third group almost that would handle that kind of stuff? Like, does it just work to have the one kind of organizational overseeing body?
Well, so let's throw a scenario out there. Let's say a brand new cloud vendor comes on the scene, like, and they're big, they got a lot of money. They're like, I'm going to throw 40 developers at Knative because we want to make sure that we're going to basically remap the way you do eventing so it works with our products. We have a very special way that we like to do that. And we're gonna pay for all that. We'll pay for all the developers. We don't care if we have a seat in the steering committee or not. I mean, we're gonna just throw people at this thing. And there's some other company represented in the current contributor pool who is already invested in the current way that it's done, and that this would mark a significant disruptive change to their business model because it changes the fundamental way they deal with the product. And who's going to decide what's right there? Like, what happens then? This is a very realistic scenario, by the way, and this has happened.
Yeah, and I agree. I think it's similar to the function scenario that we also experienced. And I think there needs to be somebody, whether it's the TOC or the SC or some new thing that we come up with, but there needs to be a defined place where people can look at for making those guiding decisions.
Right. And in the current proposal, that's the steering committee. And in the current proposal, those people, the people from Jaice's Google 2.0 whatever company that are being contributed, that have on that steering committee have a clear and painful conflict of interests, because they have been hired for the purpose of contributing these functions. But it may well not be the right thing for the project as a whole. And I mean, I'm just stating the conflict out loud, but that I think is why there's this hesitation at the back of my head, at least, of this all sounds great and it's democratic and the people contributing are represented and there's no vendor influence. But the people contributing are paid for by a vendor. And I just can't, with a completely honest, straight face, say I really believe that everyone is going to be able to completely leave their vendor hats at the door when there is no other way for the vendors to be represented but through their employees. It's one thing if Michael's on steering and is representing IBM, with an executive hat on, right? Then I don't have to worry about it at all. If the only person that's on steering is me, for example, inevitably some of IBM's priorities are gonna weigh on my shoulders, I think.
Yeah, but if someone comes to the group and says, "Hey, we want to do X," right? And if the decision-making process actually got up to the steering committee, I'm not sure I'd want the steering committee to make that decision, right? I'd almost rather say, if you're having trouble convincing the rest of the community at the lower level of the brilliance of your idea, then you need to work on communicating why it's so important to those lower level folks, right? The actual developers in the code, because otherwise they're not going to implement it the way you like. They may add it, sure, they may add it to the code, but it's going to be wired off or cordoned off to a little section that no one's ever going to use. And so I'd rather have them engage the community to explain why this is such a valuable feature. And I know that's a painful process sometimes, but I'm not sure I'd want it to be mandated by the steering committee who doesn't necessarily shouldn't necessarily have that authority to mandate it.
I don't think steering does have authority over features, though. Sorry.
Yeah, Doug, in your scenario.
No, I mean, I think that's the difference, right? Like there are some things that are just in a working group and they can get solved low level. They're easy, right? It's the hard question. It's functions, for example, right? Some people wanted us to have a functions working group because it fits in with what they want to do with the products, and some didn't. And there isn't a low-level working group you could have had that discussion in, I don't think.
Right, but that's a good example, because to me, that is something that says, okay, it goes to the steering committee, but not for the steering committee to say whether this is a good or a bad idea. The steering committee looks at the charter of the organization and says, do these folks have a right to start a working group around functions? Because based on what the charter says.
Well, but who changes that
charter? Who writes the charter? Right.
Well, right. But that goes back to, obviously you have those two groups and you got to figure out the right voting thing between them. Yes, but different topic. That's why, but remember back, that's why when I suggested some text for the charter, it was very specifically, or I'm sorry, I very specifically avoided concrete language in terms of what features are there. Rather, it's what does the community want at the time, or that kind of thing, right? I got very wishy-washy because I don't want the steering committee or anybody else to write down in words in the charter, this is all we are, because that's going to change tomorrow.
Yeah, well, but I think the fundamental point still remains, no matter how we look at it, whether it's the charter or the steering committee or the work group leads, there will always have to be some group of people who are empowered to make the decision. And I think we just need to name them. Like, is it the work group leads? Is it somebody has to be it, whether it's low in the hierarchy or high up in the hierarchy.
Yeah, I think that, so the worst case scenario, in my opinion, is that you have wars of attrition at the PR level. So people are basically creating really good quality code. It passes all the tests. It's like introducing some really new innovative stuff, and the PRs just don't get merged or reviewed, or you have these just ridiculous knit threads that go on and on and on forever in these PRs and nothing ever moves forward. Like, that's where a project will die. And that's why there has to be some relatively well-worn path to say, I'm trying to do something, I'm getting friction from the community, how do we resolve this? And sometimes it's good friction in the case that, we have a very clear policy around X, and this is clearly in violation of that. Or the other scenario, which I think is more common, is that there's some company that's invested in the way we're doing Y, and this goes against it. Like, that's, you want to know where the real meat of the governance is, it's right there. It's when I haven't stated that my company depends on this functionality being this specific way, and it's not because it's better or worse, it's because I'm invested in this model. And that's where you really need to be able to detangle things.
But isn't that where you would then use the fork option? Like, if one, contributor has something they want that is against what the rest of the community wants, like, I have two thoughts there. Like, if you have that kind of a situation and you're seeing it escalating up, one, I kind of always think TOC is always the top. Like, to me, TOC is the decider for any of that stuff. But, whoever it goes up to, like, if they make a decision that the rest of the community isn't happy with, you still have that mechanism of, expressing that you're unhappy with it, of course. And then and then it's a conversation. And then if we still can't reach an agreement, then, like, there's always, this is open source, there's always that option of doing a fork.
So,
and I think in that,
oh, sorry.
Well, I would say, I think in that case of, like, what Jaice was saying, of, like, if you had a third party that wanted to make some changes that, couldn't necessarily get the community agreement, like they would then be able to work on their own path, you know. Go ahead, Paul.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. The delay over Zoom trips me up sometime. I feel like we would be well served to take a step back and let's refocus on the impetus for this discussion, which is what exactly do vendors actually need some kind of representation with regard to? So one of the things that we have talked about that I think is maybe a little bit of a strange attractor to like the folks that we have here, a lot of us are developers and we tend to be attracted to technical decisions, but I'm like, I think that is a bit of a distraction because probably the best way for any vendor that wants to influence technology decisions is for them to engage in the working groups, whether it's their PMs saying, hi, this is how we consume this project, and this is how we use it in our products, in our offerings. And these are the use cases from a technical standpoint that we need it to do. That's probably going to be the absolute most effective way to engage with the community, right? But that's just one broad category of those kind of vendor concerns. The other one is I'm paying people to work on this, and I'm paying for cloud resources, and I want to talk about my available budget and all that kind of stuff. That seems to be the stickier bit, and I feel like we're getting a little into the weeds on a different subject. So I want to understand, I think, exactly if we kind of decompose that last collection of things, what does it decompose into? What are the specific use cases that we want to facilitate around the I'm representing a vendor and I want and it is my job to control cloud resource spend for open source or stuff like that. Can we take a focus on that? In the remaining 3 minutes I realize that we have scheduled for this. But I think that's sort of like, I feel in our discussions on, steering model, like that is the thing that I have a perception that people feel that the community has to provide a solution to vendors for. Does anybody disagree with how I characterize that? Is that the heart of the matter, or is it something else?
Can you restate that last bit?
Yeah.
So I'm not really clear exactly.
Okay. So one of the things that you enumerated in your comment from a few minutes ago, April, is the logistical standpoint. Who's going to pay the bills for cloud resources, Slack, et cetera?
Sure.
And I'm trying to understand exactly what are the use cases there, right? So if we think about the different practical things that are sort of use cases for vendor representation, what are they? Because it's not exactly clear to me, and I think that's what we're trying to resolve, is the tension between having steering act as individuals, but also making sure that any vendor has a way to represent their concerns about their spend, et cetera. Make sense?
Okay, I get what you're saying. And I just want to clarify, I raised that as a aspect of steering and the role of a vendor, in that position. But that is by no means the end all be all. That's just one thing that, made me think of. And it's not I don't look at it as a justification for why someone would be on steering. It's just an example of when you talk about this aspect of open source that is founded by a corporation, ultimately, the funding comes from someone. And as things transition, just making sure that path is there. we see this now with like our permissions for the calendar invites and things like that. Like, I don't even know where to begin to unravel that thread, but I want to get it documented so that as the project continues on, like whoever, you know, comes next can pick up the keys and, you know, start the engine. And so that's kind of what I'm just thinking of, is again, because like steering is that administrative kind of body, you know, does it make sense to have a representative from a lot of the organizations that are doing that work? And I think that's then how you kind of mentioned like having a third type of group. So yeah, I think that's the threat there. Yeah.
I have a slightly more concrete additional example. Imagine that all of our CI ran on one particular cloud provider. And so all of our testing only detected problems with, I don't know, one particular architecture on one particular cloud provider. I know that that has been a topic of interest as of late. And that seems like a place where, you know, oh, hey, we donate resources, but also, you know, do we have the infrastructure to actually be able to run this anywhere else? There's a little bit of chicken and egg there going on that I think has caused IBM some distress, at least. Because IBM wants to have power builds, and currently everything is, all of the CI/CD is paid for and hooked in with Google's GKE, and GKE doesn't have any power options for VM.
I was going to ask, I didn't know who did the CI/CD now, so.
It's PROW run by Google on Google resources.
Okay.
So that might
we can
be
even say that even simpler. Vendor wants to run tests on their infrastructure to find bugs in their infrastructure, and this infrastructure is much slower than what the community is now using, and you need to make a decision: should we run tests on that infrastructure and make our PRs take longer, or don't, and do not test on that infrastructure?
So who makes that decision right now?
Right now, all of the people who are working on that infrastructure work at Google. And so
with the question of like, well, but the, okay, but the question of the project determining what CI/CD, who does that go to?
Well, I think it's
POC or steering?
In the productivity working group, but I could see that being something where it might get escalated up to steering potentially as, you know, how do vendors get onto this? Where TOC could maybe point directions in terms of, well, you could start contributing here, but I think steering would be the one who would say, you know, it's actually necessary to make that space so that other people can run CI/CD.
I'd say it's the chicken and egg problem, though, right?
Yeah.
Just time check. We're now over time, so like let's cut it off in the next few minutes. But didn't mean to interrupt you, Matt. Go ahead.
So chicken and egg problem, right? And I've raised this with Chow at least before, who leads the productivity working group, which is, can someone who does not work for Google become a productivity working group lead, realistically, considering nobody outside of Google can even access the infrastructure, right? I mean, it's a pretty fundamental problem, and one I've raised with steering before when we started down the G Suite path, right? Because there's some stuff going on in CNCF around Kate's, around a CNCF owned G Suite org, and some stuff in that space. But, you know, right now, a significant amount of our productivity infrastructure isn't even accessible to non-Googlers, right? That includes the entire PROW setup. It includes the performance automation with Mako, and on and on. So
there's, yeah, so Evan and I are chatting, like, there's ways around that, because I just went through this with, you mentioned Mako, I just went through this on another project. So like, yes, totally valid issue, but I mean, it's like, I feel like there's a way that we can fix that. Maybe that's too simplistic sounding, but it just seems like there's things that we could potentially do for that. But I think it ties back into the bigger question of like a decision like that, should that go to the TOC or the SC? And to me, it should go to the TOC, not steering. I don't know if everybody else agrees with that, but.
And specifically, you mean the decision to move to more community accessible infrastructure for all that stuff?
Any infrastructure change, like if the productivity working group decided they wanted to change SDI, if we're going to say they don't have I guess it's the scenario of like, if you're going to say they don't have the permissions right now to decide unilaterally to change to something different, then do they go to the TOC to decide that? Who decides that?
Well, I think there might be two different decisions. There's the infrastructure change, and then there's the actually getting the funding. Like if we wanted to, run tests on AWS as well, someone would need to go and actually get AWS credits, which getting those resources, it sounds like, might be a steering issue. Changing the infrastructure to run across multiple clouds might be a TOC issue.
Gotcha. Makes sense.
So, folks, we're over time. I think this was a good discussion, and I'm like really happy that we had such good engagement from folks. This seems to me like we're in the middle of this discussion. So, and I know people have started taking off, but like, do we want to talk about this maybe like later in the week? How do we want to continue? Because I think that we're at least making some progress in terms of coming to view what the problems are to solve together.
Yeah, I think we should try to get together this week again. Letting go by 1 week before making progress, I think, is too long.
Yeah.
Only issue is the holiday. I know I'm taking time off this week. I don't know if other folks are as well.
Is there a holiday?
Have you heard of those?
What
Monday's Labor Day. Monday's Labor Day. So we have Friday off and then Monday off, and then because we do have Friday off, Monday off, I was planning on taking tomorrow and Thursday off. That being said, I'm still happy to check in on emails and things like that. I think one of the great things about this conversation, at least from my perspective, and I apologize for having missed the last one, that's been insane. This has really helped me kind of get a sense of what kind of like the real, concerns and kind of the scenarios are. So that to me is really interesting. Yes, Evan's right, it is perf season. But that's been really interesting to me. And so, that makes me think of these are not problems that are specifically unique to Knative. Like other projects have experienced things like this. So we can then go and look and see how others have kind of addressed it and what's worked. And so, yeah, I find that really helpful. And so to that extent, like if there's stuff that we can, collaborate on via Slack or asynchronously, I'm all there for that.
So in terms of like a next discussion, really quick,
because
yeah,
I one proposition because we are discussing that for a time, various discussions, and I'm wondering maybe better way will be to everybody to think about solutions actually, and to think about how we can solve that, and think about the proposals, and maybe somebody will end up adding some additional proposals to your PR or something, or maybe completely something different. But let's discuss on something, not discuss all around, but let's discuss on some propositions like for example.
Sure, yeah. And so in terms of like next already scheduled time that we could use for discussions, there is like public meetings scheduled for tomorrow where maybe we could continue this. But yeah, Chris, I think you make a very good point about like surfacing this on some artifacts. So if if folks want to put their thoughts on the open proposal, like in a comment, I think that's fine. I think that's Community 214. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. If you want to throw stuff on Community 214, totally cool. If you want to throw it into the notes we took today, and that's shared with dev and users, also totally fine. But tomorrow's a good time. That's already set up to talk about it. April, I'm sorry that, well, I'm happy for you that you have PTO scheduled. But
I mean,
I know that maybe
you know,
that doesn't
I could
overlap well with
probably
steering.
attend anyway, you know. Sorry, I
Okay.
would say it's the nature of open source. You never really get time off. So,
So true. But yeah, well, thanks everybody for attending, and you know, we'll see folks tomorrow, but I'm sure that we won't. I think this is a kind of tough nut to crack. So let's just all put our heads together.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Go
everybody.
team.
See ya.
Bye.